Afternoon all. I'd like to explore a possible useful idea to revisit that notion of strategic crush which I've mentioned in past videos. And one of the conclusions was it was a sort of to make the positions easier to play was one idea, like if you have an entrenched knight on d5, for example, the opponent's got a hole on d5, or any structural weaknesses, you've got good outposts. And this was influenced, actually, one of my most favourite books ever was Chernev's Most Instructive Games of Chess Ever Played, and I'll give you this link in the description of the video. This is a game collection on chessgames.com, and a lot of these examples, really, I was just revisiting the idea of strategic crush recently, and maybe a better concept is not about having the position easier to play, but rather what I call to be independent of the opponent's tactical resources. And to me, this strikes a chord with Nimzovich and Nimzovichian type thinking, where he talks about putting your position beyond defeat before going onto the attack, like Art of War, or consolidating position first. And let's look at some concrete examples. Now here you see the themes, and themes are actually tied in with this idea of reaching a kind of independence of the opponent's tactical resources. So without actually plunging into the specific examples, we can see from the theme description some clues of what we're going to get from these examples. So rook on the 7th, how would that be independent of the opponent's tactical resources? And I know some of these games, of course, from memory, and we've done a video on this channel about this game. Capablanca, he sacked one or two pawns, got a very aggressive king and a rook on the 7th. And once the rook on the 7th was established, I think the opponent's king was kind of trapped and inactive, and Capablanca's passed pawns provided the final kind of winning trump card, even if he was like a pawn down. So rook on the 7th is a kind of creating, another way of looking at it is a virtual bind to be independent of the opponent's tactical resources. A rook on the 7th theme achieves that. A king is a strong piece that also achieves that. It can be such a devastating weapon in the endgame, as Tao showed in this game. And I urge you to have a look at the concrete examples, but in relation to the theme, and the theme in relation to this new concept, which I think could be more powerful than simply the concept of strategic crush as a way of getting easier to play positions. Instead of that, this independence of the opponent's tactical resources. Now, a knight outpost on d5 is what I was just talking about earlier. It's not because you want an attractive looking knight visually or an easier to position play necessarily. You want the knight to actually win the game. And actually the knights on d5 in this example, it provides a winning attack. There's no resistance. So even if the opponent spent ages and ages and ages, there's going to be no resistance to the attack if it's got such a knight sometimes, as this game demonstrates. But I urge you to go into the example, explore this theme, then explore the relationship of that theme again to this new notion of strategic crush. And you might not be convinced at this point by anything I've said. It's fine, it's just a theory. I don't claim to be a grandmaster. Once up to 2270, once national under 18 champion, but I'm just a candidate master. This is just an idea, just a brew in your thoughts. Aggressive rook in the ending. Again, if you have an aggressive rook in the ending, sometimes the opponent can't do anything. A virtual bind. A passed pawn is a virtual bind because you're tying up the opponent's resources to try and keep that passed pawn under lock and key. So that's a kind of virtual bind. Bind is the same concept. It's the same Nimzovichian concept. If you have a bind, you have less to worry about. Your position has security in a Nimzovichian sense. If your position has security, you can be more independent of the opponent's tactical resources. Weak pawns, weak squares and mighty knights. Here's a classic Nimzovich game we've covered on this channel. It wasn't just the doubling of pawns. Even when they're undoubled, Nimzovich had fantastic knights. For example, on c4 against a restricted bishop. The bishops just were hopeless. They were silly bishops. Silly in that structure. So it showed how weak pawns do translate to these mighty knights, and we get a kind of virtual bind on the position again, and tactical security again, and the position beyond defeat. Really, at what point was Nimzovich in risk of losing this game? Go through the game for yourself, convince yourself. Strategic crush, if it's not equal to this, I think this is more convincing. It wasn't just easier to play, it was winning. It doesn't matter how long the opponent fought, he was in such a bind by that stage. A physical bind, you just can't move. Similar to that, to the Nimzovichian masterpiece like this. Finesse in the end game. Well, in the end game with reduced material, sometimes you can win with finesses. Have a look at that game example as well. Phalanx of pawns, Petrosian, getting pawns, the connected pass pawns, the pressure of the pawns. Again, a pass pawn is basically a virtual bind. You might not think of a pass pawn as a virtual bind, but it locks down so many resources that you are kind of creating a bind as if you just played a bind, like a Moxie bind. It's locking down the opponent's resources and giving your position great security, and it's obviously potentially winning. Rook and pawn ending, king in the centre, shifting attack. So that might be from the queen side to the king side, and it's very, very difficult for the opponent to do that, especially when the opponent has less space. It's easier to shift attacks from one wing to the other. Now this one was about provoking weaknesses. Petrosian's great at provoking weaknesses. In the Dutch, we've covered this in a broadcast show. Korchnoi had so many weaknesses, and Petrosian manoeuvred first like a knight to e5. He got an aggressive pawn chain, and the winning blow was very, very powerful. That's a very, very impressive, crushing defeat of Korchnoi. So that, even the idea of Petrosian's strategy of provocation and then sort of hijacking everything, the opponent's vacuum of weaknesses, creates a virtual bind as well, because the opponents cannot do anything after. There's too many weaknesses to take care of. As you'll see in this game example, the kingside attack. In a way, a kingside attack is a virtual bind, because the opponent sometimes cannot do something about the attack. It's just too brutal. You get a kind of virtual bind. And again, the outpost is revisited with this game, Magnificent Outpost. I remember, GM Summerscale saying to me he was going to take one of my games as a lesson for a visual knight. You don't just want visually impressive workhorses, war horses. You want your knights to actually help you win the game. So it's not just about easier to play. I don't think that quite cuts it, and that's the reason for this video. I'm challenging my own concept here. I'm showing that with you, that it's not just about easier to play with the outposts. It's about being independent of the opponent's tactical resources. Seesaw check. I mean, these kind of tactics are really lethal. Zugzwang, the opponent's compulsion to move, and other tactical tricks. Have a look at that one as well. The two bishops. If you have the two bishops, they're really complementary on both colour complexes, and the opponent simply might not have the technical resources available to deal with them. Steinitz, first world champion, he emphasised this as one of the positional elements. He won lots of games with the two bishops, or entrenching a knight in a secure place with a secure knight outpost. So the opponents of Steinitz, faced with these positional games where Steinitz was accumulating these positional advantages, doesn't matter how much they worked at the position, once they were strategically in a bad position, if Steinitz had the two bishops, it was insurmountable pressure quite often. Have a look at this game. Variety of themes. Of course I can't comment, but Tartko is good with his quotations, and he's a good guy, so check that out. Now this one is a very, very clear-cut example of dark square weaknesses. We've covered it on this channel, and the king actually marches up to deliver the coup de grace. So dark square weaknesses, insurmountable tactical problems. Doesn't matter how resourceful the opponent was after a certain point, the dark square weaknesses that Yates created couldn't be defended. Infiltrations on the dark squares. Rooks on the 7th, another example. Tactical resource independence. You get these massive positional trump cards which act as virtual binds, the opponent can't do anything. Doesn't matter how long they spend thinking about what technical resources might be available, tactical, technical, they're not going to find anything. Have a look at this game. Very, very clear-cut positional play. Of course, a clear positional blunder from black at some point with f5, just weakening e5. Powerful pass pawns again. Pass pawns are a form of bind. This is something I've been thinking about recently. If you think of pass pawns as binds, the important point of that is at some point in the game you're going to have to think harder and more resourcefully to try and get a pass pawn or try and stop the opponent getting a pass pawn. And the reason why you might want to put more effort at that critical turning point of the game is a pass pawn can provide an insurmountable bind. So if you can avoid it or create it, you could end up winning the game or at least not losing the game. So if pass pawns are this notion of binds, you have to really work hard for the pass pawn concept. Bishop and a half. No comment on that one. Problem like final. No comment. No comment. Elegant simplification. Simplification into an endgame is often providing, with reduced resources, it's often actually easier to win, less to worry about. So endgames are also a focus of many of these examples. 4 endgames in one. We know Magnus Carlsen's brilliant at endgames. There's less tactical resources for Magnus to worry about. He can grind often people in endgames. Bishop and pawn endgame deluxe. Dispatching the King's Musketeers, Petrosian and Smyslov. King safety. You're tying up the opponent's resources defensively. Petrosian's not known as an attacker, but in many of his games he was a vicious attacker. It wasn't just provocation play. Odyssey of the isolated pawns. Structural weaknesses like isolated pawns can provide a basis for getting rid of the opponent's counterplay and tactical resources. So maybe this is an example of exploiting an isolated pawn. Zugzwang, the invincible weapon. The opponent's compulsion to move is a weapon in itself, a bind in itself. So have a look at that one. Symphony combinations. No comment from a strategic angle. Escorting a potential queen, again, pass pawn as a bind, so critically important as a concept, the pass pawn. Web of black squares, dark square colour complexes, weak squares in general, can provide problems which are really difficult to resolve tactically, and the opponent could just be going down a slow, slippery path to destruction if they have a weak dark square complex or a colour complex, light or dark squares. Check that one out. Endgame arithmetic, again, the importance of the endgame to win in a sort of riskless manner without counterplay is noted here in many of these game examples. No comment on that one. March to the Little Pawns, pass pawns. Pillsbury, shooting star, an American star. He won Hastings, one of the peak achievements, amazing. Pawn rollers. With pawn rollers, the pass pawns gain in strength. Connected pass pawns gain hugely in strength. So Capablanca made use of one as black here in this example. Quiet like a tiger, Botvinnik can. Dutch classical. Against the Dutch, there's some strategic weaknesses to often focus on, so I think that will demonstrate that. Endgame duel, again, another endgame example. Perennial favourite. Boko versus Reti, French defence. Okay, so check out these examples, but as I say, the question, and it's not an answer, I'm not giving an answer, I'm giving a question. Is it about being impressive with knight outposts or pass pawns, or is it the bind aspects that you're actually creating positions where it doesn't matter how long the opponent spends thinking, they're in a tactical bind, so it's independent of their tactical resources? Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.